Hey, while we've got just a couple minutes, can I just share a screen for a minute? And all I'm going to do is I'm going to advertise, yes, the next class, as one does when one has opportunity. So March 21st and 28th, Laura Kazamchek is going to do, what's the title, Ben? What is the title? Theology of the Resurrection. I should have put the title in there. Anyway, Theology of the Resurrection. You can read that. That should be fun, though. Theology of the Resurrection.
She's in seminary. Neat.
All right. So yeah, as Kurt mentioned, this is the middle of 3 sessions that I'm doing. And last week we looked at the Ecce Homo, the Behold the Man scene, which is essentially Christ's trial, and him being presented to the people and them shouting, "Crucify him." So we considered that in its context of history and politics and faith. This week we're going to look at the crucifixion. And then next week, the prodigal son, which you're all thinking, how is that a Lenten meditation? And I don't know, but I'll figure it out by next week. It's sort of, it implies the resurrection. But happily, it turns out the next couple weeks are going to be, after that, are going to be the resurrection. So we're going to get the full Lenten cycle in. So this week I want to talk about the crucifixion. But before we jump into it, I should tell you, I'm going to take a little bit different approach. We are going to focus a good deal on key texts from the Gospels about the crucifixion narrative. Not every moment in the narrative. I've selected some, so we'll be moving selectively through the Gospel of John, his account. And we will look at that, and we will look at images related to that. But I equally want, if I can pull this off, to address that word meditation. How is it through prayer and meditation that we enter into or get ownership or belong to this Christian narrative? And so I'm going to look at images first, and then I'm going to focus on, at the end, on a kind of an approach of asking, how exactly is it that prayer and meditation works? And I don't have an answer to that. I'm putting that out more as an exploration and a question. Now that I'm ancient and retired, I'm trying to turn my life more towards contemplative prayer, and I don't know what I'm doing. So I thought, why not subject all of you to my questions? So that's where we're gonna go. So last week we did the Ecce Homo, and I want to bridge from that just very, very briefly to say that one of the things we learned last time is that there were 2 primary depictions of that moment where Christ presents, or where Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd and says, "Behold the man," and they have that discussion, and the crowd ends up calling for crucifixion. One way of looking at that artists have approached is the one we talked about here, which is what I'll call the historical narrative. It's a way of depicting the history. What happened? Who was there? Who were the players? And it really is a visual narration of the text. The other way of depicting it is to isolate just the most important figure, to isolate Jesus alone at that time of sorrow when he's been beaten and crowned with thorns. And that moves us from sort of reading the text as an historical account to meditating on the text in terms of its meaning to us, its connection to us. And I want to suggest that those 2 dimensions are crucial to having our identity. We exist in history and we follow the narrative of history, but we also exist as individual persons with souls who want to connect deeply and directly to the divine. And these interweave. So I love that there's these 2 different ways of depicting. So if we move to the crucifixion, we find the same thing going on. We find two ways of depicting it. One is like this. We'll come back to these paintings as once I get rolling. But there's depictions like this, which are very much the historical depiction. Here, the painter Mantegna wants to get all those little moments in the narrative in. Let's look quickly. I'll do a little inventory here. Of course, the central thing that matters is Jesus on the cross. And so dead center in the painting, largest, you see him there, frontal crucified for our contemplation. But you also move your eyes around and pick up the narrative. The thieves are on each side. The thief on the left is in light. That's on Jesus's right. And that, of course, is the thief that asked Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. Jesus inclines his dying head towards that thief. The other thief on Jesus's left is in shadow, and he looks away from Jesus. So right there, you've got a really great subplot going on between Christ and the two thieves. Or you can drop your eye down and move to the left side of the painting, and there between the thief and Christ's crosses, you see the Marys. You see Mary, mother of Jesus, almost passing out. Behind her, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of Clopas, and a couple of the other women that followed Jesus. And so you might linger there and wonder about Mary's experience or Mary Magdalene's experience. Or you might move a little further to the left, and there you see John, who wrote the gospel we're reading. And you see him standing there at the foot of the thieves' cross, but gazing up at Jesus in grieving. Or you might even move further left than John and see a pile of skulls there in the far left border of the painting. This is, after all, the place of the skull, Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. Or your eye might wander back to the center in the bottom, where you see part of a Roman soldier with a spear. That spear traveling up the cross. This, of course, is the soldier that will pierce Jesus's side, and the blood and water will come out. Or you might drift further to the right, where you see the Roman soldiers casting lots to divide Jesus's garment, and so on. So very profound depiction of the cycle, the narrative of the crucifixion scene. Now, in contrast, the other way of depicting the crucifixion is the more iconic or devotional way. And here, typically, the artist strips out most of the story, knowing that we know it, and focuses only on Christ on the cross, Mary and John at the foot of the cross. Gives us here, for example, shallow space and that beautiful red cloth behind, where you even see the creases that have been ironed. That's actually the altar cloth that would be over the altar. And this painting would be behind the altar. So when you came up to take the Eucharist, you would look at this image. And this becomes a very personal connection to the crucifixion, where all the noise of the crowd is gone and deep space is gone. And you're in a very private, intimate space with him. So those are the two main ways that the crucifixion gets depicted. And each of them really operates in a very different and important realm for us as people of faith, you know, the historical narrative and the personal, private, or contemplative. All right, so now I've set you up. So I want to move into following text and image, because that's the whole premise of this meditation, is this link of text and image. And I'm going to do this a little bit differently. As you can see here, my first text and my first image are not the crucifixion. These are from the Last Supper. The Last Supper is when Jesus first laid out this business of his body being broken and his blood being shed. I doubt that these disciples really understood what he was talking about. In fact, they clearly were puzzled if you read the text. And I want to use this as a bookend. In the center, then, we'll look at a lot of images of the actual crucifixion. And then at the end, another bookend, which is, I'll show you the text from Corinthians, where Paul reminds us, and this is the passage our pastors use when we take communion, about the body and blood. So historical event in the center, bookends of the symbolic or the meaningful meaning of the event on each end. So let's read. This is from Luke. And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, "The cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. But behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me on the table. For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." So we enter into this intimate, private meal, this first symbolic action, the first Eucharist, I suppose, in a way. And there we see the disciples around the table, Jesus in the center, Judas on the front side of the table, isolated already, his head, though, frighteningly close to the head of Jesus. Now, if we have time, we can come back and look in depth at some of these. There's so many profound subtleties in the way the artist presents this. Let's move then from that, of course, through the Ecce Homo, Jesus' trial. "Here's your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew, Golgotha. So here we have a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, showing us the crowd, Jesus there in the center in blue, carrying the cross. This ugly crowd around him, haranguing him, mocking him, pulling him with a rope. Bosch adds an interesting element, quite unusual, forward at the bottom, where you actually see the two thieves also being led to the cross. On the left is a thief who's contending with the people that are hauling him to the cross. On the bottom right is a thief who actually kneels down and confesses to a priest. And this, of course, will be the priest that will talk to Jesus and ask him to remember him. So Bosch quietly adds in that subplot. Where they crucified him and two others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the center. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one piece. They said, therefore, among themselves, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. This is a kind of unusual composition. It's a Northern European artist. He actually rotates the 3 crosses, puts the thieves to the left, one in profile, one frontal, and then has John and Mary standing there at the foot of the cross, kind of in a central circle of crosses. And then with Jesus on the right, looking down and beholding them and taking care of his mother, making sure she'll be okay after he's gone. In the meantime, the dark clouds roll in there in the upper right corner. This is a very foreboding, dramatic, dark image. As I say, we maybe can return to some of these if you want in our conversation, because the style here is so emotionally powerful. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, "I thirst." Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it to his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." You might notice it's finished for the two thieves as well. The thief on the left, there's a kind of angel holding up his soul in a cloth above his head. The thief on the right, there's a demon, a devil, kind of a winged bat-like devil, carrying his soul off to hell while Jesus dies in the center. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. This is one of the most psychologically intense images, and actually one of the few images where you kind of see that spirit being given up. Because it was the preparation day for Passover, and the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And again, another scripture says, "They shall look on him who they pierced." After this, they took the body of Jesus. And bound it in strips of linen with spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. And so there they laid Jesus. So let me move from that narrative of the crucifixion to Corinthians, where Paul writes, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" So this is us. This is how we now enter the meaning of the crucifixion, is through the Eucharist, the taking of communion. So here's a nice Protestant Reform painting. You'll notice Protestant Reform paintings are never very exciting aesthetically, but they're very didactic. They want to teach us what to think. But basically you have here, again, still the altar in the center with the crucified Christ. And in the foreground then, the Eucharist being delivered. The bread on the left there to a woman, and the cup on the right to a man, as the preacher on the far right exegetes the word. So it's a very Protestant kind of image. As you're looking at this, though, I want to focus for a minute on that word remembrance, because of course we all know this is what we're doing when we take communion. We are remembering, and especially at Easter, Lenten season, and communion takes on a kind of richer intensity because it's wrapped in the whole meaning of the season. And maybe in Easter, at the most, we really bring back or remember this crucifixion scene. We often, for example, do a Tenebrae service, Good Friday, Ash Wednesday, to really bring these things home. But if I could focus for a minute on the text of that word remembrance. Our word remember, if you break that word up, it is literally remember. Put the members back together again. And that's what we're doing in our meditation. We're reassembling. We're calling all the members back to this drama and focusing on them. The root of remember, memoir in Latin, is to be mindful. And that surely is what prayer and meditation is about, is becoming mindful. Again, if you break that word up, it's such a profound word, to be full in your mind, be mindful, to be thinking. This is, I think, what prayer is to become mindful, to remember. Kind of remarkable words, really.
Yeah.
Sometimes we say to ourselves, let me remind you, which is literally remind. If I am reminding you this morning of the crucifixion, what am I doing? I'm giving you a mind, right? I'm reminding you. There's really something profound in that. And so what I'd like to do before our, actually I'm out of my talking time, aren't I? All right, I'm gonna do this super fast. I want to take you to a prayer book. This is a 15th century prayer book. This was owned by Mary of Burgundy. You can see the book there. A prayer book has text on one page and an image on the other page. And so it is a meditation book exactly for the kind of purpose that we're talking about here, where we understand through text and image the meaning. I've opened it here to the page of the crucifixion. So this is Mary of Burgundy holding this book in her hand, meditating on the crucifixion. On the right page, she reads the text, and you can see in the letter D, which has been made very large, there's an image, and that image is the sacrifice of Isaac. So she recalls back to the Old Testament. Remember in the Old Testament how it keeps saying, tell your children these stories so they'll know who they are. Remind your children of these stories, remember these stories. So she's remembering Abraham and Isaac. She's reading the gospel text of the crucifixion. And then on the left in the image, she's seeing the crucifixion. Now I'm going to really condense this. What you're seeing there in the foreground is Mary of Burgundy's domestic space. This is where in her house she prays. On the bottom left is her treasure chest. On the bottom right is her prayer book, the book that we're actually talking about. Notice that prayer book is open. I'm going to flip through these because I'm going to run out of time. Where is it? There we are. Notice that prayer book is open. And it's open to the devotional crucifixion image. So she's moved into deep prayer now through that devotional crucifixion image in the book. But as she does that, notice on the left there what she sees. She sees through a window where she sees the historical crucifixion. So she's connecting real history, real God incarnate, first century, with her present moment of praying and devotion. How does she do that? She does it through prayer. So you'll notice now her prayer cushion is on the sill of the window, and her rosary is draped down. This is, of course, pre-Protestant Reformation. And so it is through prayer that she's able to enter that window. That window becomes a transition from secular to sacred space, from present to past. And as you look through that window, you'll notice there's a column on each side with sculptures framing that window. And the subject on those columns is on the left, the bottom there, sacrifice of Isaac. On the right, Moses lifting up the brazen serpent. And so it's through those Old Testament stories, through prayer, that we enter into the historical crucifixion. Now, there's something else, though, really remarkable here. As we go through that window, you see the prayer cushion there. Right above it, you see a woman in a light blue dress turning around and looking back at us. This is actually Mary of Burgundy, who is holding this book praying. Through prayer, she has entered into the crucifixion, but she looks back out through that window at herself or at us, saying to us we need to be connected. And it's through meditation that she connects. One last point here. You'll see in the center, of course, Jesus nailed to the cross, not yet risen on the cross, or the cross is not raised. And that whole historical crucifixion scene unfolding around him. If you look at the back on each side, you see two crosses and ladders. These are the thieves' crosses. So the thieves' crosses are already raised and the thieves are already crucified. In fact, the Romans are climbing down the ladders after having lashed them to the cross up there. Next, we'll be raising Jesus's cross. But there's a very odd problem here, because in every crucifixion image and in the biblical text, Jesus's cross is in the center, and it has to be higher than the thieves' crosses. If you look between the thieves' crosses here at the terrain drops down into a kind of a little valley. If that cross is put up between the thieves, there's no way it's going to be higher. So that's kind of an odd problem. But if you look back at Mary there, who's turning and looking out at us, and notice right next to her, you can see a rim of dirt just past the windowsill. You see a rim of dirt. Can you guys see my cursor? It's right here.
Yeah, we can see it, Wayne.
And once you meditate on this, you come to realize that's the higher mound on which Jesus's cross is going to be raised immediately in our face. And now Mary's looking back has a new meaning. She's looking back towards the mound where he will be crucified. And the implication is that we, the reader, the prayer, are now totally drawn in. We are literally stepping out through a window of prayer onto a mound where Christ will be crucified. And the whole point of this is to make it real to us. Okay, that I've gone kind of over my time, so I will stop there and we can enter more into conversation about these things. So let me just open up. Maybe people have questions or comments or hopefully observations, and I can flip back to different images. But I'm also interested in your sense of how prayer and meditation operate to make things real in our life of faith.
A question I had, there were a couple of the pieces of art that had the thieves with their arms more or less straight up and up over the top of the cross rather than stretched out. And I don't recall seeing that before.
Yeah, we could do a whole study on how crucifixion was depicted. And one issue is, since most of these are older paintings, their historical knowledge, maybe they literally did not even know how crucifixion happened. No, people had not been crucified commonly for a long time, although some places in the medieval period, Renaissance period, did still crucify. So it's kind of the artist's invention in some ways. in this case, like Mantegna differentiates between how Jesus is crucified and how the thieves are. But part of it is to make it show the pain. But they're somewhat winging it, honestly. We now have deeper research on actually how crucifixions happened, and it's not like any of these, apparently. But yeah, so I think of it more as an expressive, probably an interpretive expressive approach.
I mean, I don't remember if it was something you said last week or if it's something I've heard somewhere else, but the idea that in order to depict something in a painting, you actually have to have a lot of knowledge in the area to have it taken seriously. And so the idea that this was being depicted as well as possible at the time and needed to have some clout in the way that it's depicted is interesting. And then to find out later that it's not very realistic would be also, like, it's a very interesting concept to me that it's as well as it could be at the time, and then still the essence of it still needs to have meaning.
Yeah. There, for those of you who are, if you have more interest, there's a great book by Yaroslav Pelikan, he's a historian at Yale, called Jesus Through the Centuries. And he actually goes through how Jesus was depicted century by century. And one of the things he shows is that how every era can only really comprehend the biblical narrative through the terms of their own culture. And one of the things we seek to do in burrowing into the scripture is to get beyond our own local perceptions, to try to get to a universal perception. But it's still going to be couched in terms of what we know. Now we're living in a postmodern era with huge technology, so we're aware of many cultures and their different contexts. But in earlier periods, you kind of knew your valley, your city-state. So that's always true. The particular and the universal are always blended, and the particulars are almost always our own. What else do we know?
I have two questions, Wayne. That Pelican book is not a picture book, is it? It's not the paintings plus the text. It's just the text.
He does have images. They're, because he's an historian, they're not beautifully done the way an art historian would demand. But thanks to Google search, you can just find each one and enjoy it on a better reproduction.
The second thing that I noted about this was the historicity of many of these paintings. So whether or not they are depicting Jesus in a very intimate setting, or they're depicting Jesus in a much more, I don't know if you'd call this communal setting like this one that we're seeing now, they seem to be very artifact driven, right? Here's Mary, here's John, here's the three thieves. And there seems, whatever spiritual effects seem to be present or kind of buried or cloaked within the imagery that's already there, rather than trying to depict what spiritually might be happening on the cross as a more direct thing. I'm just wondering about that, if you can comment on that. Is there a stream of that maybe I'm not aware of and that you chose not to depict, or is that just a little more unusual?
A big part of that has to do with the fact that in actually almost every painting I'm showing you in those eras, very, very few people could read. Very few people had books. And the church committed as early as the 4th or 5th century to the idea of a visual Bible. And when you find increasingly imagery spread throughout the church, on the walls, on the doors, etc., that was not idolatry. That was the visual Bible. Nobody could read or afford books. And so that was the way it was communicated. So these images are always deeply grounded in that kind of historicity. You need to teach the people what the story is. They need to see it. And that also kind of goes to Melissa's point. Therefore, a lot of the details are culturally specific to the time. That is, though, the reason that this iconic tradition develops right alongside. where the artist strips away all that historicity and detail. I mean, this is a 1450 painting, and the garments are what they imagined first century garments to be. But mostly they strip away that historicity to then focus on the deeper spiritual meaning. And last thing I must say, though, is to depict what's really happening spiritually, which we think of, I suppose, as internally, is a kind of pictorial abstraction that doesn't really happen until modern art, when artists begin to probe into the idea that art does not need to depict the world. It needs to really interpret the spiritual or emotional meaning of the world. And that's part of why abstraction actually emerges. So that here, Francis Bacon, this is one of the few 20th century paintings I showed you. The references there to historicity are minimal. It's enough to ground you in reality. But really, that's a completely internal picture of emotional agony. And Bacon abstracts considerably to make that happen. So yeah, so those layers are powerful. I have a bunch of, I'm definitely over-prepared. I had about 30 more crucifixion images at the end. But here, for example, with Rouault, as you get into the modern period, there's enough reference to that historicity. But mostly now, shapes, forms, colors, texture, brush strokes, simplification. These are used to charge us emotionally with the inner feeling. Or like Chagall, where from a realistic standpoint, these are quite distorted. From an expressive standpoint, they're really beautiful and profound because they really move us.
Yeah, Wayne, I was quite taken by your taking the word remembrance and talking about mind, remember, mindful, and so on. Do you think that because of the Protestant tradition where they have removed Christ from the cross, it's more difficult to be mindful and remember what took place?
That's a very loaded question.
Well, I don't mean it as loaded,
No.
because when we look at this, it's just, we remember, it's powerful.
Yeah.
The Protestant church, you have the cross without Christ. And I know the Reformation and so on, but do you think it's more challenging for us today to really remember and be mindful of what took place without the image of Christ on the cross?
Yeah, I do. Now, historically, the Reformation, of course, was reacting against kind of over-the-top uses of images, but yeah, the Protestants' removal of Christ from the cross and their removal of all imagery, where they whitewashed the interior of the churches and they said no images, sola scriptura. But one of the things they missed is a church without images, with whitewashed walls, is an image. It's an image of nothingness. And my feeling's always been it shifted us sort of subconsciously towards something more Gnostic, where we focus on word and text, but kind of forget that we were created with bodies and Christ was incarnated with the body. And that's been the argument of those who favor images, in favor of having crucified Christ image, is that their argument is without text and image, you don't have the whole thing. You only have half the story.
Because you probably know it, in the military, the chaplains, they have one cross. And for the Protestant services without Christ, for the Catholic service, they turn the cross around and Christ is hanging on the cross. Cross. And I found that can be pretty powerful for, anyway.
Yeah.
I was just postulating with Ben, a sidebar.